Thank you for coming on, Susan. It was quite a fast decision last weekend to do something about the whole coronavirus and the recession that we find us so suddenly in. And I saw you were preparing a webinar for small business owners on all the legal issues that come up. And I know that many of my clients were nervous about canceling or postponing events. But there are many other things that have come up that are not just around events. But before we dive into that, can you share with the audience a little bit about you and your background?
Certainly. Well, thanks for having me on. We were just saying it's great that you've been able to pull this together so quickly. So well done you for helping your communities. So I started out life as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer in the city, doing £1 billion deals. But in the last 10 years, when I set up my own business, and I've been really dedicated to helping small business owners and particularly online business owners. And I have my own very large community. And as you say, I do lots of trainings for them. I've just written a book on GDPR, which seems a little bit irrelevant at the moment, if I'm totally being honest.
Yes, that's correct.
GDPR seems to have gone totally out of the window in the light of the current concerns that we have.
Yeah.
But that's GDPR for dummies. So maybe when things have calmed down, people, or even if people are self-isolating, it might be a good time to read that book and get all your ducks in a row.
Yeah.
But no, I do a lot of work with small businesses, but obviously I have the background from very large businesses to understand both sides of the spectrum. And I run my own small business, so I totally understand what small businesses are going through at the moment.
Yeah. And I loved what you did, GDPR, whether we like it or not, it came and you showed there a massive initiative, creating a Facebook group in the middle of all the questions and worries and fears people had around the topic. And that became the go-to Facebook group in whole of Europe or maybe even worldwide for a long time. Now it's a bit quieter, I guess. But yes, the book is out. So go ahead and check out the book from Suzanne. And now you've also started a new initiative for people who suddenly find themselves working from home. For us, it's not new. No. But for those who were put in this situation suddenly a few days ago, they're scrambling for information. They're also worried. So congratulations on that. Again, I love how you are quick in taking the decision on creating communities for those who need.
Well, I think it's vital, isn't it? And especially, my online communities have kept me sane over the last 10 years when I've been working from home, because I'm an extrovert, I'm very social, but that's really kept me going. So for those people who are new to working from home, it might be quite a big adjustment. So yes, I set up another Facebook group called Remote Working During COVID-19, and we're trying to support people in there. I'm speaking on Sky News this evening, actually, in the UK, about what small businesses can be doing to protect themselves during this period of time. So I'm just eager to get my knowledge out there as much as I can to help small businesses.
I love that. And that's why we're finding us together here today, because we both love to help people and serve them in these challenging times. So when it comes to all the legal issues, the first one comes to mind, canceling, postponing events. Now, what is there to watch out for?
Yeah, so obviously I know you've got an international audience, Sigrun, and I'm qualified in English law. Sorry, 1 second. Challenges of working from home while kids are off school. Jessica, I'm on a call now, darling, so you need to go outside straight away. Daddy's home now. Go and see Daddy.
I don't want to home.
Jessica, can you leave right now, please? It's very important. Yeah, just go and talk to Daddy. Sorry, Sigrun. Clearly did not leave my instructions clearly enough with Daddy. Have words with him later. Okay. So yes, I completely understand what it's like for small businesses, because I am one in this position with children interrupting my interviews. If they do that on Sky News tonight, there will be hell to pay. I can tell you that much.
Oh, remember, it happened to the guy on the Sky News where the child came running in.
Exactly. Although it could go viral, they might be doing me a favour. So anyway, as I say, I'm only qualified in English law, but most countries around the world have very similar doctrines. So what I say will be of general application.
Yeah.
So the main thing to think about in these times is what is called force majeure, which is actually, it comes from French law, but certainly in the UK, and I know in the US, and most other English-speaking jurisdictions, we have this concept of force majeure. And what that means is, and it very much depends on how it is written into the contract. There isn't an implied term or a common law right of force majeure. So very much you need to be looking at the text of your contracts and seeing what's written in there, and looking very closely at the actual wording of your force majeure clause, if there is one, because they do vary quite significantly from contract to contract. But the essence of a force majeure clause is that it will typically define what is a force majeure event, which means something that is outside of your control. Now, some clauses will go on to list maybe 10 or so examples of things that are outside of your control. So typical examples, if I just turn to my list here, typical examples that you might see are acts of God, floods, drought, earthquake, other natural disasters, terrorist attacks, civil war, commotion or riots, war, threat of war, armed conflict, embargoes, sanctions, nuclear, chemical, biological contamination, collapse of buildings, etc., etc. Now, if you have a list that includes the words epidemic or pandemic, which are two that are often included in a list of force majeure clauses, then you are in the strongest possible position. Because, as I say, it's very important to look at exactly how these clauses are drafted. Some will try to expand the clause as widely as possible by saying that during an event outside of your control, including without limitation, and then a big long list, the key words being including without limitation, which, so it's giving examples but not defining it completely. The obligations of the parties are generally relieved during the time of the force majeure event, and then ultimately the agreement is terminated if the force majeure event continues for a certain period of time. But again, it really depends on the exact wording of the clause. So if, as I say, if you have a clause that says during a force majeure event, including a pandemic, both parties' obligations are relieved during the time of that event of force majeure, then what that means is that for the supplier no longer has to deliver the goods or perform the services, but equally the customer doesn't have to pay. So if you're on an ongoing payment plan or something like that, that would be suspended for the period of the force majeure. Now, as I say, some clauses will say that after a certain period of time of that force majeure event occurring, sometimes it might be a matter of weeks, sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 6 months, and then a party will have the right to terminate the agreement. And generally it's expressed as a right, not an automatic consequence. So it would be for one party to say, okay, this force majeure event's been going on for 3 months, I need to find a new supplier, or not, as the case may be, and it would be up to the parties to terminate that contract. So if we take a practical example, if somebody maybe has booked a venue for an event that they are having, then obviously a lot of those types of contracts will contain cancellation clauses that work to the favour of the venue. So what I think businesses need to really carefully weigh up is the timing of their action. Because if you try and cancel before there is actually a force, obviously the first step is to look at the contract with the venue and see what the force majeure event clause says. And if there isn't one, then that's a different matter, and I'll come on to talk about that in a minute. But if there is one, then you need to very carefully look at the timing of events so that you're not trying to cancel before the force majeure event is triggered. Okay. And also what businesses need to think about is whether it is actually better, and this would be the case if there isn't a force majeure clause as well, but if the supplier, the venue in this case, isn't able to perform its obligations because, for example, there is a government law that says there are no mass gatherings over a certain event, certain number, If they are not able to perform that, then that would be a renunciation of the contract.
Yeah.
And then if they can't perform that, then certainly under English common law, and I believe the US has similar common law, the venue would have to refund you any deposits that you've paid already.
Yeah.
Okay. So timing is quite critical. And what I've seen a lot of people do, and I think venues are being quite accommodating on this, is that they are allowing people to postpone the event until a certain time.
Yeah.
And they are keeping the deposit, but agreeing that the venue can be postponed, the event can be postponed to a later date.
Yeah.
Now, if I think a lot of venues are saying you need to hold it in this financial year.
Mm-hmm.
And now, accounting wise, they don't need to do that. They're just trying to get the business in during this financial year.
Yeah.
And what you can do is, if you haven't already cancelled and your event falls in a period when they are not likely to be able to perform, then you can say, well, look, I can just leave this. You won't be able to perform, and then you will have to repay me my deposit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And which will give you more negotiation to actually say, look, keep the deposit, but I need to extend it to next year because, I need to raise sponsorship, I need to sell tickets, and people are not going to be in the right frame of mind for this for another, however many months, etc. So there are ways that you can negotiate in that regard, regardless as to what's written in your contract.
In the contract.
So the starting point is absolutely to look at the contract that you have in place with the supplier. And not just for force majeure rights, but also certainly if you are looking at exercising a force majeure clause and relying on one, you need to look very carefully at the notice provisions in the contract. Because if you don't serve the notice in the correct way, then you might be in breach of the contract yourself and the other party could sue you. And that's the same for termination rights as well. Again, you need to make sure that you are following the notice provisions. And when I say notice provisions, for those who aren't so familiar with what that means, notice provisions are things that will say, if you have to serve a notice under this agreement, and that will be things like if you want to advise them that you're relying on a force majeure clause or a termination clause, then you have to send it by post, by courier, by email, etc. And what it will normally then go on to say is that if you are sending it by post, it needs to be by first class registered post, or if it's by courier, it needs to be signed for, or if it's by email, then actually it just says by email. And then it will also have provisions about when it is deemed to be received. So first class post, typically it's either 1 or 2 working days, typically 2 actually, because it tends to give a little bit of leeway on the postage system. By email, it's typically 24 hours after it's sent. And by courier, it is when it's signed for. So often force majeure clauses will have a provision that says that you have to notify the other party within a certain period of time of becoming aware of the force majeure event. So a contract I looked at recently had 2 days. So if you fail to act similarly, so it's a very fine balancing act as to when you react, because if you have a contract that has this provision about you have to notify within a certain time period, if you miss it, then contractually you've lost that right. So you have to be very careful about that. But that's why the notice provisions are key, because if you need to know, if you've got a force majeure clause where you need to have served notice within 2 days, then you might be looking at having to do it by courier to make sure that it's there in time, for example. So you need to look at it very carefully. I think my general advice would be, if this is a high value contract that people are trying to use a force majeure clause over, whether you are a supplier or a customer, take legal advice, because it is a complicated area and not one that is black and white. And I'm going to go on to termination clauses, but I'll just pause in case you've got any questions on force majeure before I go on.
No, well, I just 2 weeks ago, I kind of decided to postpone my conference long before most people had to. And I did what you said. I read the contract, and I didn't look specifically at force majeure, but I was looking at until when do I have to cancel? How much do I need to pay? Because even though I had an idea that an event ban would eventually happen, I somehow didn't wait. I didn't want to wait for that to happen. And my event was going to happen in June. So 2 weeks ago, the rumors was, oh yeah, this is just April. By May, it will be over.
Yeah.
Now we are not so sure anymore. But 2 weeks ago, I felt I had to take a decision because I had until 18th of March to only pay 10%.
Yes.
And well, luckily for me, they allowed me to postpone by a whole year. They kept, of course, my deposit, and there's no financial other consequences. So both sides are happy. But it's you know, what if it falls, like, let's say you have an event in end of May or beginning of June, where it's not so clear right now if the event ban will still be there, but this is hurting someone who has planned a workshop, seminar, event, or whatever. They can't sell tickets anymore. So basically the event is ruined already, even if the event ban may be lifted by then.
Yes, well, if it was me and there was a prospect of cancelling and only paying the 10% deposit, then that's what I would be doing. Because that's something you can plan for, and you know that will be your maximum exposure. Otherwise, you know, if you're already at a point where you're looking at, you know, sort of 70, 80, well, anything over 50, whatever is a lot of money for you, you know, 20% might be a lot of money. Then, you know, I would be, I mean, certainly here in the UK, we're talking about a 3-month, you know, interruption here as a minimum. So I think if I was running an event in June, I would, if I was a betting person, I would be thinking that you know, there will be restrictions in place to stop that event going ahead. And I would use that in my, because we want certainty, really. You don't want to be on the edge of your seat until June to see whether you're on the hook for this or not.
No.
But I would just be using that. I would be educating myself about the legal position, and I would be using that to go into negotiations with the venue. So if they're being awkward and saying, you know, you can't postpone it till a certain date, or, you know, some people might be in a position where they can't postpone it. Maybe it was a conference or an event about a very relevant, up-to-date matter that won't be relevant in a year's time or whatever. And or there's unique circumstances that mean that it's just not possible. And in that instance, you know, I would be using my knowledge of the law and having, or engaging a solicitor if you need to, and negotiating with that venue to come, you know, because if they think that there's a risk of them not getting anything, then you might be able to negotiate a settlement of, you know, 5 or 10% or whatever, which you're happy to pay because it's certainty for you. And they're happy because it's better than nothing. So I think that most of these scenarios will be negotiated outcomes. I think there is a sense of, you know, we're all in this together and we're trying to work together to come to solutions that are good for everybody. But if you have a strong legal footing and you can point to something in a contract, then obviously that gives you a very strong negotiating position. Or if you don't have the written contract that's strong, if you know about your legal rights, equally, you're in a stronger position. So do remember this. So on the one side, you've got the express written force majeure that you can use in your negotiations, depending on what's written in the contract. And on the other side, remember, you've got the common law rights, which are that if they can't perform their obligations, then you know, then that is effectively a breach of the contract. It's a renunciation, a repudiation rather, of the contract, and that means that they would have to repay you your deposit, etc.
So what if someone is planning an event now? You know, I postponed my conference to next year, and we are looking at sponsors and just thinking of anyone who's planning a workshop. Like, we assume that hopefully by fall things can go back to normal and we go back to live events. We will be so desperate to meet each other. We will be like the cows in spring. You know, we will be going to events, and that's what I'm foreseeing, that we will be craving meeting people in person. Should we be putting some clause in, you know, pandemic? Like, how should we, as you know, someone who hires speakers or working with sponsors, what should we do?
Yeah, so I would absolutely be taking this opportunity to look at all of your contracts and tighten them up for future possibilities. But you need to be careful with the drafting of force majeure clauses, because sometimes they will work to your advantage and sometimes they won't. So it's certainly in your terms with your ticket, people who buy your tickets, I would absolutely be having a force majeure clause in there to say that if there is an event of force majeure, then we can postpone the event and not have to refund you your tickets. And some people might think it's more reasonable if, well, sometimes you see these types of clauses and it's limited in time. So, you know, if we have to postpone the event for more than 6 months, we'll give you a refund, but otherwise we won't. But those are the kind of things to be thinking about. And you certainly want something in your, if you're a conference organizer or you're running any kind of event, you want something in your terms with the attendees of the event that it allows you to escape your obligations in the event of a force majeure, anything outside of your control. But then you need to think about it in a slightly different way when you're the customer and when you're contracting with the venue, for example. You need to make sure that it's protecting you as well as, so I've seen some, for example, where the force majeure clauses are one-sided, and some where I saw one actually where there's a number of listed events are mutual, but then other events are not mutual. So you need to look at that very carefully to make sure that you will benefit, not just the venue. So you want to make sure that it's not just the venue that can escape their obligations, but also that you can. And connected to that is termination rights.
Okay.
And again, you know, this would be a good time for people to review their customer and supplier contracts to check that they have appropriate termination rights in there. And the best type of termination right, if you're the one wanting to terminate, is what's called termination for convenience. And really that's just being able to terminate the contract for any reason on a certain amount of notice. So it's probably not likely to apply to contracts for venues, but certainly for other, you know, consultancies, things like that. It is reasonably normal to be able to give, certainly if you're on a retainer for a consultancy or something like that, you would expect to see a right to be able to terminate on a certain amount of notice. Now, if you're the customer, then obviously you want that period of notice to be as short as possible. And if you're a supplier, you're going to want that period of notice to be as long as possible. So have a look at that. In terms of what people can do now to escape liability from contracts, I know we've focused a lot on the venues, but if small businesses are, you know, experiencing a cash flow crunch and they're looking at contracts with suppliers and thinking, which contracts can I get out of because I just can't afford them anymore, then those termination clauses will be key to understand when you can terminate and when you can't. So as I say, if you've got a termination for convenience in there, then fantastic. If the contract is too expensive for you or whatever, you serve your notice, you wait that period of time and you're out of that contract. But again, be careful about the notice provisions, because if you don't follow the notice provisions in the contract, you'll be terminating illegally, you'll be breaching the contract, and the other party can actually sue you for that. So make sure that you're following the notice provisions.
I see a lot of people, I see a lot of comments online about people wanting postponing. So let's say you're doing one-on-one coaching or offering one-on-one coaching, and then some of your clients come maybe back now and say, well, based on what's happening right now, can I move my sessions back or get out of the contract, like you said? Now, many small business owners will not have so watertight contracts, or maybe no contracts at all. What would be the general response you would kind of recommend?
Yeah, so if you are in a coaching type agreement, which is similar to, I suppose, a retainer arrangement where you are contracted to a certain amount of time from the coach, then and especially where it's a business to business relationship as opposed to a business to consumer. So if you're a life coach, that would be a business to consumer relationship. If you're a business coach, that would be a business to business relationship. And then business to consumer contracts need to be more reasonable. But business to business, really the courts think that businesses should be old enough, wise enough, savvy enough to have negotiated their terms. And even if you're a very small business with no legal experience, that doesn't matter at all. You're expected to have negotiated and understood the contract. And let me just switch this light on to get a bit better light, see if that works. Suddenly the light outside's gone a bit strange. So really it's a matter of negotiation between the parties, because if you've got a business-to-business arrangement and the contract doesn't say anything about postponing, then there is no right to postpone. Now, obviously, if the coach is unable to perform the services, maybe it was a written term of the agreement that it was a face-to-face event at a certain venue or something like that, and they're no longer able to do that, then there is if that was an essential part of the contract, the face-to-face element, and they're no longer able to do it, then that might be a repudiation of the contract because they can't deliver that, or a breach of the contract because they can't do that. Yeah. But if there's no reason why it can't continue online, then that would not be sufficient for a breach to be able to terminate the agreement. So really it's a matter of negotiation between the parties. The coach would legally, and again it depends exactly what the contracts say, but typically the coach would be quite within their rights not to allow a postponement of that. So if they are saying you can postpone it, then that's good. But it's a matter for negotiation and will depend a lot on goodwill on both sides.
Yeah. So you were talking about termination negotiation. What other issues do you see coming up from small business owners?
Yeah. So just a couple of more points on the termination, just to say that people don't think that it's just so. One other point is to think about, if you are wanting to get out of a contract, think about whether the other party has breached the contract in any way recently. That doesn't necessarily have to be tied to anything related to COVID-19, but it does have to be, well, generally, unless the contract says otherwise, it will need to be for a fairly recent breach, or you will have effectively waived that breach and wouldn't have a right to terminate. Also, the party normally will have a period of time to remedy the breach. So you have to think about that too. The other thing, just quickly, another termination right to think about is termination for insolvency. And a related point here that isn't entirely contractual is that as both a customer and a supplier, we need to be thinking about the solvency of the parties that we are in a contract with. So firstly, on the termination side, typically there are termination rights for the insolvency of the other party. It is not the case that the party who is struggling to pay their bills can terminate the contract. It's a right for the other party. And it will depend. So if you're the supplier and I'm the client, and I hear that you're about to go bust, and you can't pay your bills, or there's, and there is actually a relative, in the UK anyway, it depends how the contract's worded, but if it's by reference to an insolvency event, then there are sort of tests that need to be met that you would need to check on before you terminate. But the point is, in terms of, you need to be keeping your ear to the ground about whether your customers or your suppliers are about to go bust, because obviously what you don't want to happen is that as a client, you've paid for a lot, paid money up front, whether that's for a service or for goods, and then the supplier goes bust in the interim and you don't get those services or goods that you've paid for. And equally, on the flip side, as a supplier, you don't want to have a lot of work in progress, or be charging in arrears, or have delivered goods in advance of payment if there's a prospect of your client going bust and not being able to pay you. So this is also a good time, if you need to, I think you need to look at all of your contracts, but to look at going forwards, whether you need to renegotiate contracts so that you are in a stronger cash flow position. So that might mean that if you are a client, you're inserting milestones into a contract so that you're only paying. So in a coaching example, I know a lot of coaches will do a 12-month program and they'll take payment for that up front, for example. Now, obviously, well, hopefully there's not quite as much chance of as a coach going bust here, that, as opposed to a restaurant or a physical premises, because the coach can continue the business on an online basis. But in that example, what I would be wanting to do as a customer is saying, well, actually, can I pay you on a monthly basis, subject to me, receiving the deliverables that you've promised me. And on the other side of that fence, as a supplier, I'd be not wanting to deliver too much in advance. So I'd be looking at my contracts, trying to renegotiate them, and do be minded that there isn't a unilateral right to impose different payment terms on the other party. It's by negotiation, unless it's written into your agreement that you can do that, which would be very rare. It would need to be negotiated. You can't, if you've got that in your standard terms of business, that you can just, by your own right, change the payment terms, that would be unlikely to be unreasonable and therefore void.
Yeah.
So if you are trying to renegotiate payment terms, then it's a matter of negotiation, and you might find that you need to put in other incentives for the other party to agree it. So you might enhance your service in some way in order for the client to pay in advance, etc. So you need to be a bit inventive, I think, about how you would restructure that contract. But obviously your aim is that during uncertain times, you're not left exposed cash flow wise when you've not received the products or services that you've paid for. And equally, if you're a supplier, that you've not given out those services and goods and not received payment for them.
Yeah. But a lot of programs are like, all access. Let's say you sell a program and say, hey, you get access to all the modules, everything. Of course, a part of the service might be a weekly office hour or a monthly coaching call, but you have still access to all the content up front. And then there are people who are on a payment plan. It's not a subscription, it's a payment plan. Yes. Now, obviously, we are probably going to see more defaults. Is there anything, a small business owner, especially coaches, I guess, in this example, could do upfront to mitigate that, or reach out to their clients, or what is your suggestion?
Well, yes, I mean, you've always got the legal right to bring a claim against them for breach of contract if it is a payment plan rather than an ongoing subscription where they can cancel at any time. They have effectively breached the contract by not continuing to pay. Whether you choose to do so or not will depend on lots of different factors. But really, I think in this time, it is just purely about stressing the value to your clients, because clients will be doing that. They'll be looking at their list of outgoings now and thinking, which ones can I cut? And it will be the ones that they perceive to be the least value that they will be trying to cut and defaulting on their payments in the hope that you wouldn't take them to court. So really, it's about regular communication and communicating that value as to what, for example, I've stopped my personal trainer in person because we're self-isolating due to, I look after my mum who's elderly, and Gordon looks after his dad who's got COPD, etc. So we're self-isolating for their sake. And so my personal trainer hasn't been coming to my house. Now for me, doing exercise 3 times a week is keeping me sane. So that's the last thing I'm going to cut. So if I was a personal trainer in that case, I'd absolutely be sending weekly emails with case studies about people like me who are keeping sane, because I'm a bit of a worrier and I'm a hypochondriac at the best of times. So in this very fearful time, the way that I'm keeping sane is maintaining those 3 personal training sessions a week. Now, other people might think that, and again, it will depend on the individual and what they value, because I'm sure other people might think that's the first thing to go. And so for me, my cleaner isn't coming in, and I'm cleaning myself. Mine either. And that's fine. I can't have a virtual cleaner, sadly.
No.
But it's communicating that value and looking at and certainly in that example, if you are in an industry where you're having to adapt because in person things aren't possible, then what else can you do? How can you diversify? I was thinking about the nail salon at the end of my road. They're a very small business, and this will be just absolutely killing them. And I was thinking, gosh, how do you diversify in that scenario? Unless you've already got a big following, you can't really just start earning loads of revenue out of doing nail tutorials on Facebook. No. But can she be a distributor for her best, the products that she sells? gift vouchers, maybe they've got some translation skills and they can go online to, on one of the sort of online gig things, and do that. So I think, we've got to be, as small businesses, we've got to be adaptable. We've got to think outside the box a bit. And, probably for a lot of us, our revenue will be hit. And we've just got to, I think, be adaptable and diversify where we need to. I think for us in the online world, we're actually quite lucky because we can carry on pretty much unaffected. The thing that we've got to counter is, like I say, getting over the value of continuing with it for people who might be seeing their own income hit. And you could be doing things like payment holidays for your clients if you're working with a sector where that they will be hit. Enable them to keep having access to the materials, but then there is some kind of catch up mechanism when this is all back to normal, so I think we need to be inventive and adaptable as small business owners.
And I like that I've had 2 examples of contractors who have, upfront, or let's say proactively, sent me an email that these are challenging times. I want to, one contractor I work with, he said, I want to have 10% of what you pay me go to the self-made fund that you just put up. If someone defaults on a payment plan, then I want to actually have an extra call with that person. Another contractor that I work with was also being kind of upfront of what she could do. So I'm thinking there are things you can do that, before everything gets worse, we're kind of at the beginning of it, before it gets worse, that you can do. I was just thinking of, people that I work with, outsourced to, here's also a chance to say, okay, maybe we do a little bit less work together, but I can still continue to pay you regularly, but maybe, I don't need to do X, Y, Z. So the contract goes down by 20 or 30%, but it's still better than losing the contract.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like I say, you've got to be inventive. My mum has a cleaner that she's now stopped, and she's really reliant on that income. So she's asked her whether she can go shopping for her instead, which she's really happy to do. So she's still earning the income. I actually offered to continue paying my cleaner, and she wouldn't let me. So I think there is an element of we are all in this together, and I think that any attempts by suppliers to ease the pain on customers will be appreciated, not just now, but in the long run. So I think we all have a duty to be thinking about how we can help people who might be, less fortunate than we are.
Yeah.
And I love what you're doing with your funds, Sigrun. I think that's brilliant.
Thank you. So where can people find resources in general? I know you are in the UK, but what would they be looking for if they are looking to get some help? Of course, some can go to a lawyer, but if people are just looking for information, where can they find some?
Yeah, so I'm so I did my training on Wednesday. I've had someone turn that around into a fairly comprehensive blog post. That's going to be live on my website from hopefully later today. So that would be a good point to start with. So SuzanneDibble.com /COVID-19 business support, I think is the
we'll put the link
extender.
But
if they go to SuzanneDibble.com, then there will hopefully be something fairly obvious on the homepage that will direct you to those resources. So there'll be a sort of general blog, but then I will also direct people to free resources as well. And then also, do think about government support. I know, in the UK, we've got government support. It's not quite extending to freelancers and one-man bands as we would like at the moment, but there are petitions for that, and I think that's a constantly moving feast. We've got an announcement later today from the Chancellor that will hopefully be extending that. And so just keep an eye on what's happening in terms of grants and loans, but do be mindful that bureaucracy takes a while. I've also had emails from banks to say that they are very willing to help out small businesses and will extend overdrafts and things like that. So I think it's certainly worth having a call with bank managers as well, to tide you over until there is a possibility of a bank loan or a government or a grant. So I think that generally people are trying to work together to get through this situation. So hopefully the hardship will be minimised.
Yeah, but I also think when it comes to a bank loan or overdraft, the more proactive you can be, like earlier you can go and check on these things, the better. It's always worse, and I just know this from working on turnarounds myself, it's worse when you're in it, you know, when you're actually doing it, have no money left to negotiate. It's better to have cash in the bank account and say, hey, I need some help, or I'm just being cautious and I want to check what kind of help I can get when I need it.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think there's always paperwork and bureaucracy, so you need to start 2 weeks sooner, at least 2 weeks sooner than when you'll actually need it. So yeah, you've just got to be proactive about these things. And you know, look to cash flow and start having those conversations now, whether that's with suppliers, the bank, looking at government, you know, resources, etc., and be prepared.
Yeah. So people can find you SuzanneDibble.com, or is it .co.uk?
.com, Suzanne Dibble, SuzanneDibble.com.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to add to what the legal?
I'm just looking through my list of key points here. Let me have a look. I mean, going forwards, I would, and probably from this point, you know, if you've got one customer that is, you know, more than a single customer that counts for more than 15% of your turnover, or an industry sector that counts for a high proportion of your turnover, then obviously I'd be looking to diversify. Because, you know, I feel so sorry for those consultants that only have, you know, travel industry clients right now. Yeah. So that's one thing to think about. Look at insurance. You know, I don't think many insurance policies will be covering what's going on right now. But it probably will be something that the market responds to going forwards. Who knows? It might be too expensive to cover. We don't know, but it might be worth having. I would also be having a discussion with my insurance broker about, you know, are there other policies that that loss can fall under, and whether there is a potential for a claim. And yep, just being adaptable. So if you've got a business that is offline, is it possible to move it online? And yeah, diversification we've already talked about. So yeah, I think that's probably the key points there from a legal and sort of general business side. Yes, I think it's going to be challenging times for everyone, but I think on an optimistic note, I do get the sense of, you know, we are all in this together, and people are very much trying to help where they can. So so hopefully the impact will be minimized. Yes,
we will do our part in that. So I think it's about being of service, and also not stopping selling your services.
Absolutely, and looking to, you know, how you can, you know, there are lots of people now that are needing new services. How can we step up and fill that demand? I don't know about you, but my Facebook feed is full of online exercise classes, homeschooling resources, how to grow your own food, and wine subscription services. That's what's currently filling my timeline.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I think people are being very innovative. I've seen ads. There was one ad about, underwear, the new home office attire. There was another ad about home office break, and it was a, sexual pleasure object. So I think it's also
you obviously subscribe to much racier things than I do.
Obviously. I think it's also having some humor still. It is we cannot just focus on the negative all the time, but having some hope. And that's the whole purpose of this summit today, is to give you hope as well. So Suzanne, thank you so much for your time, and people check out her website and the blog post that's coming up today.
Thank you. Thanks, Sigrun.
Thank you so much. Thank you.